We are joined now here in studio, and it's always a pleasure to have you. James Rosen, who is a senior Washington correspondent for the Fox News Channel, he's here to talk about his new book, and his new book is pretty fascinating. It's about Dick Cheney, of all things, and it's called, I got lost it. Here's the title here. What is the name of the
Cheney
book?
One-on-One, a candid conversation with America's most controversial statesman.
Oh, here it is. It's on this page 1 right here. Yeah, and so you wrote this book about Dick Cheney, and you sat down and had a long conversation with him, and it got so long you said, you know what? There's a book in this.
Actually, first of all, great to be with you guys, both of you. The book is called Cheney One-on-One, and I spent 10 hours interviewing former Vice President Dick Cheney in his study at his home in Northern Virginia last December, shortly before he was turning 74 years old. He'd agreed to do 6 hours. We went for 10 hours.
Wow.
And you have never heard Dick Cheney open up the way he does in this book on all aspects of his life, from his childhood and relationships with his parents to his faith as a Christian, which is something he almost never discusses,
talks about,
ever.
Right, yeah.
And we got into great depth in it. From the 5 presidents he's known and worked with, including his personal observations of behind-closed-doors situations with Ronald Reagan, which is not even in Cheney's memoir, to the world leaders he's known, from Chairman Mao to Maggie Thatcher to Vladimir Putin, and, of course, to 9/11, on which horrific day we must remember Dick Cheney really ran the federal government from a bunker beneath the White House, and the Iraq War.
Why do you think that he wanted to open up on these issues? I mean, obviously, brilliant questioning by you probably led to some of that, but, I mean, he did apparently open up in ways he had never opened up before. Is it because he understands, his place now in history, and he wants to put his spin on it?
There's part of that. It also has to do with the fact that he trusts me, and he respects me, and he knew that I would be conducting the interview not from a place of hostility toward him, but from respect, but nonetheless that I would be well briefed, having covered the Bush-Cheney White House in real time, and having familiarized myself with the vast literature, including his own memoir, and that I would press him where warranted. And I think he felt comfortable in those circumstances.
James Rosen, Cheney has had an incredible life here in Washington, and really he came to prominence as the chief of staff for President Gerald Ford, right? Now, back in the day, back in 75, Gerald Ford was the establishment rhino of that time. Ronald Reagan was the grassroots conservative upstart, and that's how it played out. What was Cheney's ideology at the time? Because now Cheney is seen by many as, hard right conservative and all of that stuff.
Right, and there is an evolution there, but Cheney himself sees no great disparity no great sort of inconsistency between having worked to re-elect Gerald Ford against Ronald Reagan's primary challenge and ultimately being the Dick Cheney that we're all familiar with from the 2000s, because he thinks that Ford, even today, is underrated as a historical figure, someone who did oppose Soviet communism, someone who did care about human rights around the world and the Helsinki Accords and so forth. So he doesn't see a contradiction there. But you raise a good point, which is that Dick Cheney is an almost singular figure in the history of the United States for how long he stood at the center of American power.
Yeah. Chief of Staff for Ford, Defense Secretary for Reagan.
Congressman for 10 years.
That's where I first ran into him as a member of Congress.
Then Defense Secretary for the first Bush, and then Vice President for George W. Bush, a remarkable legacy.
And not just Vice President, but the most influential Vice President in U.S. history, really.
Talk about the time when he discussed 9/11. I mean, he really was in charge in the bunker. The president was on a plane and was out of pocket, and he sort of had to make some decisions there in the president's absence.
Yeah, and we go into this really in almost minute-by-minute detail in Cheney One-on-One, where he describes a Secret Service agent busting into his office as the Vice President of the United States, lifting him out of his chair by the seat of his pants and hustling him out of his own office and into the bunker. It's called the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. Cheney is stunned. He said everyone, and he used this exact phrase, there was a kind of shock and awe on the part of all the senior staff. He's seeing weapons get passed around. No one knows what's happening. And the communications facilities in the POC, the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, that bunker, were not up to 21st century scratch.
Really? Oh, wow.
And the first piece of advice he gives to President George W. Bush when they finally get a chance to talk, and he told me Bush didn't like it, he resisted it, but in the end he listened to Cheney, was to not come back to Washington because they needed to get their arms around what this was.
James, I think that Dick Cheney, especially in his very influential role in advising President Bush during this important time of our history, I think he will go down eventually as one of the greatest vice presidents we've ever had. But one of his biggest flaws, from my perspective, was he never defended himself. He was the honey badger of his time. He didn't care what the media and everybody said about him. But
nasty.
But in politics, you need to be able to give your supporters a narrative. You need to be able to get, and he didn't give voters anything. He says, I am who I am, that's what it is. Does he address that at all?
Yes, in fact, the very last question in the 10 hours was the first time that the words Darth Vader escaped my lips. And I asked
you held on to that, did you?
I asked if he felt that caricature of him is going to prevail in American memory of him, and whether he thinks as a consequence he is popularly or widely misunderstood. What do you think he said?
I don't care.
Pretty much, he says he's proud to have been involved in what he did, and he doesn't spend a lot of time worrying about what his critics say about him. And guess what? That enhanced his ability to operate behind the scenes, I think.
Because he was willing to make the decision and not think about what others believed.
Right. And
just what he thought was the right thing to do.
Yeah. He's not a politician who'll change his position because it's suddenly politically inconvenient to hold that position.
He doesn't lick his finger and put it in the wind.
That's right.
Yeah, you're exactly right about the guy. What do you think about him? I mean, we look at him and he comes across as sort of a terse guy at times, sort of growls at people or sort of barks at people.
Yeah, just ask Patrick Leahy.
Yeah, and let me ask you. I mean, you've been 10 hours in the room with him. I mean, does he come across that way when you get to know him, when you get a few minutes with him?
One of my chief aims in Cheney One-on-One was to rescue this man from the caricature of Darth Vader, because he's too important for caricature in American history. And what you find out is he's not Darth Vader. He enjoys a good joke. He'll have a drink with you. He's quite garrulous if you get him talking and you know how to do so. There was one point he had a yellow Labrador named Nelson, a gorgeous dog that was panting heavily throughout the sessions. You could hear it on the recordings. And at one point, this menacing figure, this Darth Vader character, stands up and announces to me that we have to stop recording because, quote, I got to get my dog off to doggy daycare. It's just not a sentence you expect to hear from Dick Cheney.
Not at all. There's another book out there that mentions Dick Cheney. It's making a lot of headlines.
Wow.
George Herbert Walker Bush, the first Bush 41, called him, it is reflecting in a brand new book now, and he reflects on his son's presidency and called Dick Cheney an iron ass, and really suggests that Cheney and Rumsfeld both were not the best advisors and support for his son at a time when he needed it.
Yeah, this appears in a new biography of George Herbert Walker Bush, authored by the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian John Meacham, for I have great respect, and who blurbs my book, Cheney One-on-One. It's not clear to me at all that the views that former President Bush 41 is offering about Cheney and Rumsfeld here are identical to the views held by his son, Bush 43. I don't know that Bush 43 agrees. But one of the things that Bush 41 said was that Dick Cheney was busy building his own empire in the White House.
Yeah.
And one of the things we talked about was the fact that so many of his aides held dual hats. They served on the staff of Dick Cheney, but also on the staff of President George W. Bush, and the reason for that was so that they could integrate the staffs. That doesn't suggest empire building to me.
Well, our guest is Fox Chief Washington Correspondent James Rosen. The name of the book is Cheney One-on-One, a candid conversation with America's most controversial statesman. James is with us for the full hour. Well, we always have to play a little Beatles music when James Rosen comes on the program.
James Rosen is the fifth Beatle.
He is the fifth Beatle.
There are places I remember.
So, James, you're here to talk about Dick Cheney and this book that you have written. How's the book doing, by the way?
Doing great. Just been out about 3 days, and it's already sold out on Amazon, and they had to order 2,400 new copies.
Wow, that's great. That's fantastic.
Thank you.
So, as you sat down with Dick Cheney, you said you started to say it was supposed to be 6 hours. That's what he said he would do.
Right.
He said he'd do 6 hours, and it turned into 10.
That's right.
How did that happen? I mean, did he just enjoy the process a lot more than he expected to enjoy it?
I think so, and I think he recognized as the sessions were unfolding that we were covering new ground, that we were exploring important areas, things, and filling in gaps even in his own memoirs, and contributing very important, in an important way to the legacy of this such a consequential presidency.
We talk about Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell when we talk about the Bush 43 administration. He didn't get along with them always.
Well, I would say it's true that with respect to both Condi Rice and Colin Powell, Dick Cheney clashed with them on very important matters of foreign policy and national security. In the case of Condi Rice, the relationship stayed cordial. In the case of Colin Powell, it really did become a kind of a personal thing.
Really?
And I asked him in great detail in Cheney One-on-One about all of these relationships, and he even had criticism for his friend and mentor, Donald Rumsfeld, and for other folks like George Tenet, who was director of CIA and famously told President Bush that the evidence of Iraqi WMD was a slam dunk. And Cheney was there for that moment, sitting in the Oval Office, and he recounts it in Cheney One-on-One. It's riveting stuff.
I got to ask you, when you talk about what he helped engineer post 9/11 in terms of revamping the intelligence and homeland security and many of the policies that our military instituted during the global war on terror, you can't talk about those things without also looking at where we are today and how the subsequent administration dismantled so much of that. Does that come up in your conversation?
Oh, very early on, yes. We get to the issue of Barack Obama, whom Dick Cheney called, in my interview with him, the worst president of my lifetime.
Wow.
Now, I took a small sliver of these 10 hours, and I published an excerpt in Playboy magazine as the Playboy interview with Dick Cheney in the April issue. Playboy has a department that tabulates if any of the content of the magazine is being picked up by other media. They tabulated 650 million hits for the Cheney interview, making it the most popular feature that has ever run in Playboy. And who'd have thunk it?
Wow, wow, that's amazing.
Yes. And so when that happened, the President of the United States himself, Barack Obama, at the annual black tie schmoozy boozy dinner, the White House Correspondents Association, I was there in the audience, and Barack Obama said as one of his jokes, I see where Dick Cheney, a few weeks ago, said I'm the worst president of his lifetime, which is interesting, because I think Dick Cheney is the worst president of my lifetime. And it shows you, there's a joke there, but it shows you the extraordinary influence of Dick Cheney.
What is the relationship between Dick Cheney and W? Because, I mean, when things happen, Dick Cheney will come out and he'll comment about it. And George W. Bush has not done that. And sometimes one feels like there is a strain in that relationship.
George W. Bush adheres to the practice established by his father, which is to refrain from criticisms of his successors. It's not a practice, as we have observed, that, say, Bill Clinton has followed. It'll be interesting to see what Barack Obama decides to do. So Dick Cheney has seen himself as the chief defender of the Bush-Cheney legacy, and he has every good reason to do that. Where their relationship is concerned, I would say that it's somewhat distant. It was never buddy-buddy to begin with. They maybe did a little fishing together, but that's about it. It was a professional relationship. And at one point in Cheney One-on-One, I asked the former vice president, do you miss him? And he says to me, do I miss him? And I said, yeah, do you miss him? And he said, well, I feel like I can reach out and touch him just about any time I want.
James Rosen, there was a famous press conference, I remember, when the media was just hammering President Bush, begging him to apologize or admit that he made a mistake with Iraq. Remember this? I mean, it's like all the reporters had teamed up. Imagine if they teamed up against this administration and coordinated questions. Now, after the fact, looking back, does Dick Cheney look back and say, okay, maybe this or that was a mistake?
Yeah, if you read Cheney One-on-One, you will see the former vice president admit quite candidly to some of the mistakes that he and George W. Bush made at different stages of the Iraq conflict, from the planning stage to the execution stage to the reconstruction stage.
Do you think it would have served him and the president if they had been at that at the time?
I remember Condoleezza Rice famously said, sure, we made thousands of mistakes. And, of course, she got hammered for 3 days. She then wound up in Iraq, and her path crossed with Donald Rumsfeld. I was traveling with Rice, and Rumsfeld had his own press corps. We all converged as one sort of amorphous blob in Iraq, and the two of them sat and did a round table with the press right next to each other, and having pounded Condi for 3 days about the thousands of mistakes, we decided to ask, well, Secretary Rumsfeld, what do you think? Now, a more gracious man, perhaps, or someone who liked Condi better, would have sort of killed you with blandness and just spoke for a minute and a half until you forgot what the question was. Instead, he's sitting literally 3 inches from Condi Rice, and he says, she's sitting right here. Ask her yourself.
We continue with James Rosen here on WMAL.
We're joined by James Rosen in studio, Fox Chief Washington Correspondent. But for purposes of our interview today, he's also the author of a new book called Cheney One-on-One, a candid conversation with America's most controversial statesman. People can go to Amazon. It's out there everywhere now, doing well. You say they just had to reprint a bunch of them. That's a good problem to have. The interview went to some like 10 hours, and I wonder, James, I know how methodical you are as a reporter. I know you are, you do endless research. You went in obviously very well prepared. But I mean, was there anything in this interview that you just walked away and went, I never imagined he would say something like that?
Very striking to me at the end of this process, and we go into this in depth in Cheney one-on-one, is how willing he was to open up to me on subjects that the one subject in advance he said, I don't like to discuss that in any depth, was religion. And even there, we got into that in greater depth than he has anywhere else, talking about his early Sunday school experiences, his sort of denominational migrations over time, and also his innermost beliefs in his faith. He told me, and it's just striking to hear Dick Cheney speak in such terms, I am a Christian. I believe in a life hereafter. And you could read all about it.
Well, I want to hear more about that for sure. And his family, a very fascinating family. And also James Rosen on, current events, because there's a lot going on that James can comment on.
And if you have a question that you'd like to ask James, 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. He's here for the entire hour.
You don't realize how much I need you.
Dick Cheney making news during a recent interview with Playboy. That's right, Playboy. Dick Cheney said that President Obama is the worst president in his lifetime. Yeah. Meanwhile, subscribers to Playboy said Cheney was the worst centerfold in their lifetime.
Conan O'Brien there, although one quick fact check, it wasn't an interview with Playboy, it was published in Playboy, but it was an interview with our guest, James Rosen, who is in studio. Look at you affecting the popular culture there, James Rosen.
Not for the first time, let's be frank.
Not at all. Your new book, Cheney One-on-One, A Candid Conversation with America's Most Controversial Statesman, is available everywhere. I want to, there's so much to talk to you about, but I do one last thing about Dick Cheney that I want to hit on, and that is how reviled he is. You call him controversial. He is literally hated by so many on the left, so many Democrats, and as I mentioned earlier, there wasn't a whole lot of pushback. There still doesn't seem to be much pushback. What is it about Dick Cheney that inspired so much hatred so early on, in your opinion? It started even in the candidates. I mean, when the Halliburton connections, even before 9/11, they hated him.
It begins with the fact, chiefly, that he is a conservative. I say in the book, in fact, that no one has drawn more vitriol from the left than Dick Cheney, with the possible exceptions of the man he served in the White House, George W. Bush, and Richard Nixon. And that's elite company. It also has to do, I think, with the fact of, as we were discussing before, of how unapologetic Cheney is for who he is and what he stands for. And they also realize how smart and accomplished he is. And I think all in all, it drives them bonkers.
One other quick follow-up about Dick Cheney, and that is his family. What an accomplished group of women he lives with. His wife, of course, is an accomplished official here in D.C. on her own, but then his two daughters, who both have incredible careers as well. Did he talk about that, his family life at all, and also, frankly, the challenge for him as a conservative, a Christian-believing conservative, with an out-of-the-closet lesbian daughter?
We did discuss his family. I had interviewed Lynn Cheney many years before, and I said to her, Mrs. Cheney, it's been suggested that of the two of you, you're the brains of the operation. What say you? And she said, well, I am the more assiduous academic.
Ouch.
But we did discuss his family life, and specifically the situation when his daughter Mary came out to him in an airport. And I said, were you surprised by that? I mean, I get the idea that it wasn't exactly a surprise to you, and you responded with great equanimity. Listen, we love you, and what makes you happy makes us happy. Not all parents would necessarily be able to display that kind of equanimity and that peacefulness with this. How did you get there? And he said to me, and this is a real shock, it's one of the most surprising things in the book, he said, it was a surprise. It's not like we sat around and everyone knew this and didn't talk about it. It was a surprise. So I found that shocking, that this was a surprise to him.
There was no indication.
It suggests to me, perhaps, that this was a man who was really immersed in his work.
Yeah.
James, you and I had the pleasure of sharing an office together for how many days, how many years was it?
8.5.
You're a saint.
8 years,
James
6 months, 35 minutes, and 14 seconds.
And 17 migraines, yes.
That's right. Well, we actually, I came to really appreciate, what a great reporter you are.
Thank you, Brian.
And I mean, I really mean that. I have such admiration for you as a journalist. And it's been sort of interesting to see since I are no longer sharing office, how things have progressed for you, and you've become such a major player. I'm asking these very difficult questions in the State Department that nobody else will ask, occasionally going to the White House and asking that question that nobody else will ask. And then there was this whole controversy where, you were being sort of spied upon.
Not sort of. It was
the
real deal, yeah.
I mean, where's that all stand now? In fact, Keith in Stafford wants to ask that question. Line 2. Keith, you're on with Brian and Larry and James Rosen.
Yes, I wanted to ask Mr. Rosen if he thinks the Obama administration is still tapping his phones and his parents' phones and trying to access their call records as they were in the past.
Do you still feel like that's ongoing?
Keith, thanks for the question. Just to be clear, my telephone was never wiretapped to my knowledge, and a high-ranking FBI official has testified before Congress that there was no wiretap in the Rosen case. What happened was the Department of Justice under Attorney General Eric Holder and President Barack Obama submitted a document in secret to a federal judge declaring me to be a criminal and a flight risk, and for that reason needed to have secret access to my Gmail account and all of my phone records from all the phones I use, my cell phone, the State Department booth line, Pentagon booth line, White House booth line, and the phone records of my parents. And that marked the first time in modern American history, maybe all of U.S. history, that the federal government declared a working reporter to be a criminal for doing his job. Not even the reporter for the New York Times who published the Pentagon Papers, Neil Sheehan, was so designated by the Nixon administration.
Cheryl Atkinson sometimes reports that she believes that her email was hacked, etc., and that she has reported similar things, and I don't know where that all stands right now, but do you feel like it's ongoing? Do you still feel you're being monitored?
Let's put it this way. I saw a New Yorker cartoon a few years back that showed the classic evolutionary sequence where it starts out as a fish in the water, and then something barely recognizable as a human beast emerges from the primordial ooze. And in the end of this cartoon, you see a man in a raincoat and a hat and a suit and tie and carrying a briefcase walking into a metal detector. And my point to you is probably the surveillance of the working reporter today who is so dependent on handheld devices and computers and laptops is probably as much a permanent feature of our landscape as the magnetometer at the airport. But you can be creative, and you can find ways around it, and I would say to all aspiring journalists, the news isn't always on your screen. Be attuned to the possibilities from human interaction.
Real fast, James, what kind of support did you get from your colleagues in the news?
Tremendous. It was the sun and the moon lining up when the mainstream media defended Fox News and me.
Oh, my gosh.
All right, more with James Rosen, more of your calls, just more everything.
That's right.
We continue with James Rosen, whose brand new book about Dick Cheney is called Cheney One-on-One, a candid conversation with America's most controversial statesman. James Rosen sat with Dick Cheney for 10 hours, more than any other reporter has been able to do, and it's chronicled in this book. We talk a little, let's go to Sam in Woodbridge, because it's an interesting, because not only was Dick Cheney obviously a very important vice president and policy-wise, but we forget about the political aspect. He was an elected official. He was a Republican. Sam, you're on WMAL.
Good morning, Sam.
Morning, fellas. My question, it's always vexed me, is why, knowing how the political landscape was, and particularly with the Vice President Cheney's physical health and such, that they didn't consider, or he didn't consider stepping down in the second term, allowing a new VP to come in, get his creds, and at least giving us a fighting chance going into the upcoming elections against what it inevitably turned into President Obama's.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I mean, a sitting vice president then running for president against an upstart Barack Obama in 2008 would have had a much better chance than John McCain. I mean, why not have another running mate?
You could probably ask Al Gore if that really is true. The fact is that Dick Cheney did offer to step down from the ticket in 2004, and George W. Bush opted to keep him on the ticket. And I think that one thing that, in fact, he tells me this in Cheney One-on-One, central to their relationship was the fact that Bush knew that Cheney was never going to run for president, and so the advice he was giving the president never had one eye on how it would affect Cheney's standing in Iowa 4 years hence. And he said that is central. That's the word he used.
How's his health?
Seemed pretty good, probably better than mine.
Really?
When we first got together, we spent 2 hours over lunch sort of sketching out how this might go. We went to a steakhouse in McLean, and I said to him when he sat down, "Now, just so we're clear, Mr. Vice President, I'm going to order a steak. Right? It's going to be cooked in butter. It's going to be a scene over on this side of the table.
Right.
And he said, well, order what you want, and he had a salad with salmon on top of it.
Is that right?
Now, let's point out one thing about Dick Cheney. Not only is he this singular political figure who spans 4 decades, he's a singular medical marvel. With all those heart attacks and the heart transplant, doctors can point to someone else who's had that many sort of issues.
Right.
They cannot point to another person on the planet besides Dick Cheney who had his first cardiac event in the 1970s and is still here to tell you about it.
Can I ask him another question about, another issue, and it is Benghazi. I know that you have done some reporting on Benghazi and the email and where does that stand? And here's where I'm concerned about it. I think there's a pretty good case to be made here, and I think the FBI is coming to that conclusion. But the decision about whether or not charges should ever be brought will be made by the Justice Department. And it seems that this Justice Department is incredibly political.
You're talking specifically about the email server.
That email server, right.
I don't think that we can, at this stage of her tenure as Attorney General, declare Attorney General Lynch to be a highly politicized Attorney General. By all accounts, she was a pretty good prosecutor. And I think we have to separate out here. It's the Congress that is investigating Benghazi. It is the FBI that is investigating Hillary Clinton's private server and possibly the destruction of evidence. Let's remember that by her own account, she deleted 30,000 emails of 63,000 total. That's about 48% of the volume. And you also have a potential problem for her in the use of this server to evade FOIA statutes. It's not at all clear how this is going to shake out.
James Rosen, I know you're on the book tour, but I know as a reporter you're following current events, and we had some fireworks at the State Department yesterday. You probably saw over the reaction to this crash, the Russian airliner jet that crashed in Egypt. I wonder, today, there's probably going to be a whole lot more questions about the reports now that it appears that it could very well have been a bomb. If you were in that room, what kind of questions would you ask? What would you want to get the bottom of today?
All the questions I would ask would be easily swatted away by, we don't discuss intelligence from the podium, most likely, because that's where this stands right now. But one question you could ask to get at this is, what do we know about the organizational capacities of ISIS in Egypt? If all signs are pointing to ISIS being responsible for this, what do we know about how capable they are in that country? Because it's not a country where we've seen them operate with great leeway until now.
But quick follow-up. The fireworks yesterday had to do with the spokesman Kirby saying that it was standard protocol for the State Department to advise people not to go to this airport in Egypt. And the CNN reporter said, no, it's not. It's not at all. If the official line is it's an accident, why would you be...
What's odd about that to me is that Sharm el-Sheikh is a resort area in Egypt. It's quite beautiful. I've been there twice. And it's where they hold a lot of presidential summits and foreign leader summits. So I wouldn't understand why we would be saying that.
There's something there. Yeah.
All right. And finally, James, one of the things that I love about you is not only are you a great reporter, you're also an incredibly good mimic. And I just wonder if you could, just for me, just because I love it so, could you please do a little Brit Hume for me? Well, I've never asked you to do that particular impression, but you do a great Brit Hume.
Well, the fact is, Brian, we're all very, very proud of what you've done on the radio since you left Fox, and I know Mr. Ailes feels that way as well. That's fatherly, benign Brit. Then there's scolding Brit. The only reason this hasn't gone to Mr. Ailes, Brian, is because we've kept it from him.
Hold on. If you're taking requests, you got to do Wilson real fast.
Brian Wilson.
Wow. Yep, that every morning at 5 a.m. All right, the book is called Cheney One-on-One. Get it. It's James Rosen.
Thanks, James.